The stories we'll talk about today are considered by some critics to be the first great American short stories. They take us back to a time when the United States of America was in a foundational period. Americans worked hard at the edge of a frontier, building houses and scraping by a simple living, while all the while, danger and mystery lurked around every corner, behind every tree, and along every trail. Old families went extinct, and as their estates crumbled, new families rose to power. It's a time in our history of great social change and upheaval, and a time when many of our principles as Americans were established. Because of that, the celebrated characters and stories from this time period offer us a window into the development of our nation, into what was going on at this time period. These old stories show us not just the development of a nation, but the development of storytelling and writing in general. These stories contain everything: memorable characters, environments and settings that you could see in your mind's eye, and conflicts that get you stirred up and reading as fast as you can all the way to the end. Furthermore, these stories contain writing tactics that frankly had never been used before, that people didn't even know you could use. At the time, storytelling was expanding along with Western culture. And when we look back at that expanding field of literature, well, we can see a lot of tricks that maybe people don't use as much nowadays, but we definitely could use if we knew about them. Many of the tricks of the writing trade have kind of faded into obscurity, especially along with the rise of filmmaking and television. There's fewer pure writers and fewer people studying literature out of a book. Because of that, you have the opportunity to have a huge advantage if you sit down and you read these old stories, because you can pick up these old tricks that are all but forgotten in current pop culture. And well, you can use them when nobody else is using them. Some of the tricks that you'll pick up from these stories, well, nobody alive knows about them anymore. So it gives you a huge advantage in your own writing and reading career, and also gives you an advantage in understanding society. So learning these tricks could give you a huge boost in your own writing career. Also, at the end of the video, I'll tell you 2 more really cool things about knowing these stories in particular. Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Aaron. I'm a former newspaper director and published short story writer. Currently, I'm working hard to get my first novel traditionally published. Thanks so much to the 64 of you who have already subscribed. And if you'd like to help out the channel, please subscribe. It really helps me continue to put out these videos. And now, let's jump right into it. The first story we're going to discuss today is Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving. It's a really interesting story, and it is considered to be the first great American short story. The things we're going to talk about, if you've seen our last video, are going to be conflict, character, and environment. So let's take a look at writing techniques really quick. So the story starts with a preface and ends with a note at the end. Now, it's a story that has some magical realism and some completely unrealistic scenes. And so these 2 notes, both in the preface and the epilogue, so to speak, offer us little bits of stories so that if we were a reader at this time period, we might better believe this short story that Washington Irving has written. For instance, the preface talks about how a Dutch researcher was studying all the events around the Rip Van Winkle story, whereas the note at the end seems to suggest that while a bunch of people didn't believe the Rip Van Winkle story, there were people who swore by the story. And so who knows if it was real or not. These notes that sort of frame the main story offer an extra bit of clout to the story, so to speak. So if you were reading this along during the time period, you might say to yourself, do I agree with the people who don't believe the story, or maybe do I believe in the story? That sort of questioning heightens the effect of the magical realism that takes place in the story. By the way, spoilers ahead. Rip Van Winkle is a simple man. He lives a simple life in the shadow of the Catskill Mountains near the Hudson River. He loves to wander off into the woods with his gun and shoot squirrels so that he and his family can eat at night. He has children and a wife, but well, he and his wife don't like each other very much. If you're one of those people who's been reading old literature and you say to yourself, man, these old guys sure do complain about their wives a lot, well, this is one of the original stories where that's the case. So Rip Van Winkle travels around the small American town. There's the usual people that we'd expect: the vagrants, the innkeeper, the barkeep. All those people make up town. And Rip, well, he's a very well-liked guy. He does a lot of work for other people. He teaches kids how to shoot and how to play games, but he's a really unsuccessful farmer. Because he's so unsuccessful, his wife continues to nag him. One day, Rip wanders off into the wilderness with his loyal dog, and as he's out there exploring the mountains and looking for something to hunt, he is passed by a mysterious troop of people. What I want you to imagine right now are the small little Dutch figurines where the people have noses that are way too big, they're wearing red coned hats and the coveralls, and they're singing to each other in voices that you can't quite hear. Those originate from Dutch fables, but also they come from this story. So Rip Van Winkle helps one of these guys carry a keg up the mountain, starts drinking with them, and falls asleep. And after that, a lot of magic ensues. So I don't want to spoil the entire story for you, but it's a really interesting story because of how the town is characterized, and we can see over a huge passage of time how much this little Dutch town in the United States changes and becomes a very big, sprawling town, even within the course of 20 years. It also hits our imagination because, well, the wilderness was wild and completely unexplored by the settlers at the time. So there was a belief that really anything could happen. If you wander out into the woods, you could run into this, magical being or some magical creatures that might do terrible or wonderful things to you. It depended on their whims. So this is a very scary time to be away from the safety of your town, even though the safety of your town and the safety of domestic partnership can have some trials and tribulations of its own. It's a really fun story, it's magical, it's got really interesting characters, and it's one that's deeply embedded into Western culture, so I highly recommend you read it. On to story number 2. The second story we'll be discussing today is Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now, if you know anything about Nathaniel Hawthorne, you'll know that while he was writing and publishing, he was really not well liked, especially by the church community. Hawthorne stands against the idea that the narrative always gives you the truth. He writes about the Salem witch trials, and he writes about women being blamed for adultery while men get off scot-free. And in general, he writes a lot about how the statutes and rules of the church are observed by some people, but they're ignored often by the most pious acting people. For instance, preachers were often the ones who got off scot-free for doing the worst things, even though they claimed to understand what God wanted from them. Young Goodman Brown is a story that follows directly along with that track. It opens with our protagonist, young Goodman Brown, as he leaves behind his young wife, Faith, to go off into the woods and be enticed by a deal with the devil. As he goes off into the woods, he realizes that it's not just him going, it's all the other members of his town, including his ancestors, people long dead, the teachers who taught him what piety was, and of course his beloved preacher. And young Goodman Brown has to grapple with the idea that all of humans could potentially become sinners and are perhaps tools of the devil, which in this time period would have been a very big deal. It's a story that was not well received when he published it. However, it's one that is, we'd probably look upon very favorably today, especially with what we know about the development of certain religions and, well, you know what? I'm actually not going to get all into that. The story ends on a very melancholy note in which our main character, we don't necessarily think he has a happy life after his big ordeals, whether or not he chooses to go to the devil. It's something that we kind of leave up to the readers to decide. It's a great story, and it's looked upon more favorably now than when it was written. And of course, that's something that always interests me. For the author to publish something that goes against what's popular at the time, that he ends up being right about. And finally, our third story. Let's get into The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. So most of us have heard of Edgar Allan Poe. If you can think of any movie scenes or television scenes where there's a big dark stone mansion and then the big piano plays the ringing notes and thunder crashes in the background while the bright full moon hangs over everything, well, that's straight out of an Edgar Allan Poe story. In fact, it's straight out of this story. The story follows a young protagonist who receives a letter from one of his old friends who's in terrible health. Our protagonist rides horseback across the country to visit his friend and hang out with him and try to raise his spirits. When our protagonist reaches the house of Usher, He sees the house that we've described from the television shows and the movies. The very stones are crumbling and ivy is coming up the walls, and maybe you can see a crack going straight up through the mansion. As the protagonist goes through the story and tries to console his friend, he has to live in this very creepy mansion where the doctors and the butlers are creeping around and they're not talking to each other, and everybody seems to be scheming. Meanwhile, his friend is suffering from melancholy and delirium, but most importantly, this oppressive sense that anything that could happen to him would damage him. It's the sensibilities that we know that Edgar Allan Poe lived with in his own life, and it's interesting to see him describe that in a character who sees doom and gloom around every corner, who's living in this great, huge mansion, and yet feels claustrophobic at all times. So the language in the story is very dim and dreary, and the sentences are really long, and I have to be honest with you, I'm not the biggest fan of Edgar Allan Poe. To me, it's a huge slog to try to read through any of his work. Every sentence has 4 or 5 different conjunctions, so at the beginning of the sentence, you have an idea, and by the end of the sentence, you can't even remember how the sentence started, and so you have to reread it over again. Now, that's just me. I know a lot of people who I respect who really love Edgar Allan Poe, and of course, he's had a huge impact on American media and storytelling. So even though it wasn't my favorite story, I can't deny the effect that it's had on American culture and the value of reading it. Well, those are 3 short stories that I absolutely hope that you read. And now let's get into our 2 bonus items for benefits that you would get if you choose to read these stories. Firstly, you'll have a better understanding of how the country developed. Things like magical realism or believing in fairies or other woodland creatures that might be magical, well, that made sense in a time where things were dark and very dangerous, and violence lurked around every corner, and people were trying to carve communities out of the edge of a forest. While magical realism might seem something to scoff at today, it certainly wasn't back in the day. Similarly, for somebody to criticize religion, and not just criticize religion, but all of the people who pretend to be pious in Nathaniel Hawthorne's view, well, that was a radical view to have at the time that it was written. But nowadays, well, it's popular to question religion. So we can view Nathaniel Hawthorne as one of the fathers of the movement away from very strict hierarchical religions in which if you were in charge, well, you could decide what was right and anything you did was okay. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, there's a huge community of people who read great literature, including short stories. If you choose to take the time to read these short stories, you'll be shocked at how many people you've unlocked a great, deep conversation with. People love to talk about great works of literature. It's one of the reasons why people love short stories so much. And odds are some of the smartest and most interesting people that you'll ever meet have read these stories, or at least they've heard of them or they've heard of the authors. Taking the time to read and form an opinion about these stories gives you a valuable opinion to put into a conversation, and it makes you an interesting and valuable person to talk to. By reading these stories, you choose to join a sort of a fraternity or sorority of other people who have chosen to read these stories, who have taken the time and put in the effort to think for themselves critically and figure out what they like or dislike about the stories. So reading these stories is sort of like grabbing a key to a really widespread club, one full of some of the greatest people you'll meet. At least that's what I've found when I talk to people who read a lot of books. Thanks so much for watching, and speaking of, please leave a comment if you've read these stories. I'd love to hear what you think about them. Let me know if there's anything that I missed with regards to these stories or add to them. I'll pin all the top comments so people can be sure to read your thoughts. This is a very small channel, so of course I will respond to every comment. And if you choose to subscribe, well, I really appreciate you doing that. This is a very small channel and every single subscription helps. Well, everyone, I'm gonna go eat my dinner. I think I'm gonna make some fajitas tonight. Make sure you get enough sleep and drink enough water. Get outside, summer's right around the corner. And well, I'll see you next time. Take care.